Hi, I'm Sushant and welcome to this online tutorial by Quest. This tutorial is a continuation of our series on neuroanatomy. If you have not watched the previous videos, I would recommend that you do so before proceeding. To interact with our surroundings, we need the motor system. We need this to carry out certain voluntary activities, but we also need this for carrying out involuntary activities or accessory movements. In this tutorial, let's talk about various aspects that help us in control of this motor system. For the motor system to work, we need the muscles. Muscles are the ones which are going to contract and bring about the actual activity. And these are the extrafusal fibers of the muscles that contract, and they are being supplied or controlled by the nerves. If we trace these nerves backwards, these nerves are coming from the spinal nerves, and the spinal nerves are arising from the spinal cord. The cell body of these nerves is sitting in the anterior horn of the gray matter, and this is known as the lower motor neuron. This lower motor neuron is having its processes that goes from the anterior root of the spinal cord, enters into the spinal nerve, passes through the plexuses, through the peripheral nerves, and finally at the neuromuscular junction. There are three things that would control the lower motor neuron. First, it needs a voluntary control from the cortex. This is done by the pyramidal system. But the pyramidal system, that is my cortex, as it sends a signal down to the spinal cord, also sends a copy of that signal to the nuclei sitting deeper to the cortex. These are the regions of the basal ganglia and areas in the brainstem. The job of this system, the second system, is to tell my pyramidal tract, is it doing the work properly or does it need to fine tune? This extra system is known as the extrapyramidal system, and this extrapyramidal system is also going to control the activity of the anterior horn cell. Also, in the last tutorial, we had mentioned that the sensory system, though it is sending a lot of its impulses up into the CNS, will send a copy of that signal to the anterior horn cell. If the stimulus is very powerful or noxious, at that time the anterior horn cell can be directly controlled by the sensory system. This is what we called as the reflex arc. Together, we can say the pyramidal system, the extrapyramidal system, and the reflex arc are able to control the activity of the lower motor neuron. The job of the reflexes is to stimulate the neuron immediately. That means if I have a noxious stimuli, I would want the muscle to contract immediately. Imagine if I am doing that every time for every stimulus, I would not be able to carry out any coordinated activity. And if I want to carry out any coordinated voluntary activity, my pyramidal system usually is going to inhibit the reflexes. It is going to tell the reflexes that you don't need to work, I will control things in a coordinated manner. Now, remember, none of these systems, pyramidal, extrapyramidal, or reflexes, would be able to work if the effector neuron, that is the lower motor neuron, is damaged. If the lower motor neuron is damaged, nothing can eventually reach the muscles, so no motor activity can be carried out. Since the lower motor neurons are going to get inputs from the pyramidal and the extrapyramidal system, as well as a continuous firing or feedback from the reflexes, it is going to maintain a low-grade firing within its own axons. This low-grade firing by the lower motor neuron is going to cause a baseline level of contraction in the muscles. This is known as the tone of the muscle. This baseline contraction of the muscle is responsible for maintaining our posture. Also, since the muscle are going to have a baseline level of contraction, that will help in its nourishment. We know that when a muscle does not contract well or is not used for a long time, it will start losing its nourishment and would start shrinking in size. If we see a patient who has had a damage to the lower motor neuron, what is known as the lower motor neuron lesion, that person would manifest with a loss of tone in the muscles. Also, since no electrical activity is reaching the muscles would immediately lose power. Reflexes are also going to be lost because there is going to be no way that the reflex arc gets completed right up to the muscle. Also, since no electrical activity reaches the muscle, either from the voluntary or the involuntary sources, the muscle is going to start shrinking very rapidly. It loses its nourishment, and this process is called wasting. These are then the characteristics of lower motor neuron lesions. Moving our attention to the pyramidal tract helps us in control the voluntary activity. We know that the parietal lobes have the motor cortex, and the right-sided parietal lobe would control a left side of our body, and vice versa. The cell neuron sitting in the motor cortex would give out cell processes which would become the white matter as it starts moving downwards towards the spinal cord. Initial arrangement of this white matter is in a fan-like manner, and this is known as corona radiata. The corona radiata is moving from the cortex and trying to reach the brainstem. But while it does so, it has to pass through a narrow area between the nuclei in the brain known as the basal ganglia. This narrow area passing between the basal ganglia is known as the internal capsule. The white matter from the internal capsule would reach the anterior aspect of the midbrain. It would descend down along the anterior aspect of the pons and the anterior aspect of medulla. On the anterior aspect of medulla, it would create a bulge of what is known as the pyramids. Also, at the level of the medulla, these tracts are going to cross over to the opposite side. This is known as the pyramidal decussation. From here, it gets the name of being called the pyramidal tract, and since after crossing it is going to enter the lateral column, it is also known as the lateral corticospinal tract. The lateral corticospinal tract or the pyramidal tract is further going to descend downwards on the opposite side from where it originated, and it is going to descend up to the cervical, thoracic, lumbar or sacral areas and give out its shoots to the respective anterior horn cells. Any damage to the pyramidal tract will lead to features of what are known as upper motor neuron lesion. For someone who has suffered an upper motor neuron lesion, there would be a loss of power for any voluntary activity. Also, since the inhibitory control of the pyramidal tract is lost, the reflex arc would actually get exaggerated. Patients would manifest brisk reflexes, and also since the firing in the anterior horn cell because of the reflex feedback would increase, the tone of the muscles would go up. However, since the voluntary activity stops, over a period of time the muscles will start losing their mass. This isn't called wasting, this is called disuse atrophy. We have to understand a very peculiar aspect of the upper motor neuron lesions. Any damage to the pyramidal tract would lead to upper motor neuron lesion. But if there is a damage to any level of the spinal cord, the level of damage, the pyramidal tract has lost its activity, and therefore level below the damage, patients are going to manifest with UMN type of features. But at the level of damage, along with the pyramidal tract, the anterior horn cell is also damaged. It is the effector cell, and if that loses function at the level of lesion, patients would have feature of lower motor neuron lesion. To summarize, the anterior horn cell or the peripheral nerve, if that is damaged, that would lead to lower motor neuron type of features. But any damage from the cortex up to the level of spinal cord to the pyramidal tract would lead to upper motor neuron lesion type of features. At the level of damage in the spinal cord, however, it is always going to be lower motor neuron type of features. I have summarized the differences between upper motor and lower motor neuron lesions in this table. If there are any questions on this topic, feel free to discuss with me on the Quest tab. Thank you and Jai Hind.